Picture this, if you will. You're about to send a text message. You read it for one final check, and you notice something's off. It sounds a bit too eager, so you rewrite it, but, well, now it feels forced, so you try a few more times, and before you know it, it's been over an hour, and your text is still unsent. This is what it's like living with a high level of self-awareness. We are told that being self-aware is necessary to live a life of authenticity, yet the more you know about yourself, the less about yourself you realize you know. In the words of ancient Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi, once I dreamt I was a butterfly, fluttering here and there. Suddenly, I woke up and I was Zhuangzi again. But I don't know. Am I Zhuangzi who dreamt I was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming I'm Zhuangzi? This is the terrifying paradox of self-awareness, the moment we begin to ask, who am I really? We split into two. In that instant, we become two different people, the one who asks and the one who's being questioned. And if finding yourself requires watching yourself, are you really discovering who you are, or are you performing for an audience of one? In quantum mechanics, observing a particle changes its behavior, so a photon is normally in superposition, meaning that it appears to be in both point A and point B at once. However, once you observe it, it collapses into a single position of either A or B. As an oversimplification, you could say that the photon doesn't want to stay in one measurable state. Superposition is more or less its normal way of being. The same thing happens with human consciousness. In our default state, we exist in superposition, both as the observer and the person. But the moment you become self-aware, you effectively split into two people. One is the actor, aka the one being observed, while the other is the critic, or the one doing the observing. Therein lies the paradox. Self-awareness indirectly feels like a performance between an actor and critic, and less like a whole person reflecting naturally. It happens so unexpectedly that you don't fully acknowledge when your mind is in this mode. Have you ever had a moment where the music it hits just right, and your body responds to the beat, and suddenly, all by yourself, you're just enjoying a spontaneous experience that you weren't looking for, and then it happens. Physically, you're still the only one in the room, but mentally, as soon as you lock eyes with yourself in the mirror, the critic lets itself in. You become self-conscious and start wishing that you danced a little better, you had more rhythm, you looked more graceful. You remember the last time you watched someone hit those moves and how much better they looked. You wonder when you'll be able to dance that well, and slowly, you lose the beat. Your movements become stiff with self-doubt, the critic takes over completely, and you stop dancing. With self-awareness, you can't have everything all together at once. You can either know what you're doing or why you are doing it. But observing one changes the other. The you who acts naturally and the you who understands yourself cannot exist simultaneously. They can come close enough in terms of when either version of you pops out, but they cannot be together at the exact same time. Picture yourself on a date. You finally found someone with a sense of humor where you don't need to constantly hold yourself back or filter your words. Instead, conversations feel natural as words spill out of your mouth. The moment you think to yourself, well, hey, this is going well, you're suddenly thrown into performance mode. As you begin to poke at your behavior to understand what's making the date so good, you may lose grasp of the part of yourself that was just being you. After a while, you might start to wonder, what gives? Here's the unspoken part. You know how we mentioned the actor and the critic? Well, the truth is, while these roles feel necessary within your psyche, neither of them are your authentic self. Self-awareness doesn't even highlight an authentic self to begin with. Instead, it creates a new, observed self that is fundamentally different from your authentic self. What is memory? By default, we picture memory as recollections of past events. But neuroscience has a tiny yet redefining caveat to what we call our memories. You see, every time you recall a memory, you're not just accessing a file, you're rewriting it. The act of remembering can and often does change the memory. Scientists call it memory reconsolidation. So the past as we know it, something set in stone, well, in reality it's always being slightly modified to fit the current narrative that we tell ourselves about the world. Researchers at the University of Texas actually tried to observe this effect, and what they found is that we have a malleable window, which is essentially a few hours where a recalled memory is vulnerable to being updated, strengthened, or even distorted by your current emotions or your environment. Here's what that means for your self-awareness. You know how self-help encourages you to confront past memories to understand them better? Well, that's a good thing. But sometimes when you analyze your past to understand yourself, you're not actually discovering who you were. Instead, you're only creating a narrative that overwrites your original experience. And this effect can be especially dangerous in our current era, where therapy speak is more popular than ever. Today, many people assign clinical terms to events that they never truly experienced as traumatic. But because of the present story they tell themselves about that event, they unknowingly adjust those memories to fit into the boxes of trauma, which then affects what they believe about themselves. Take a moment and think about your first heartbreak. Back then, all you likely knew was that it really hurt to lose someone you thought you were going to spend the rest of your life with. However, as time passes, you learn more about relationships and how they work psychologically. With new knowledge on attachment theory, you give the memories of your first heartbreak another go. This time through the lens of what attachment styles each person had. Now you've learned that she was likely avoidant while you were anxious. So your anxious attempts to get closer to her ended up pushing her away due to her fear of eventually being abandoned. And all of it suddenly feels resolved. Now, months down the line, you learn about feminism. Not just the definition, but its real meaning. You embrace it in a way that has you acknowledging its impact across various aspects of society. It feels revealing to uncover just how important it is for women to actually have a proper say in the way their life plays out. So then you revisit the memory of your first heartbreak. This time, the feminism lens uncovers something that you never really understood before. At the time, you were more focused on keeping the relationship alive, so you downplayed her interest in a study abroad program, believing that it wasn't worth the distance. Well, now you've learned that you might have been tying her down, and that could also work as a reason for the breakup. The problem is the fact that your past self didn't have your present self's awareness. You're inevitably studying someone who doesn't exist anymore, using tools that they didn't have. At the time, you were only reacting with the understanding that you had. Later, a more wise version of you steps in and rewrites the meaning. You lose touch with what losing your first love felt like and exchanging it with a new meaning now. But pain, grief, or fear isn't something that should be constantly assigned with specific responses. Your first heartbreak doesn't need to find its reason in attachment styles or a younger version of you being anti-feminist. Instead, you took that loss for reasons you may never truly understand. It's entirely possible that she found someone else, or her parents disapproved of the relationship, or any other reason another human being can have behind their own decisions. You don't need to justify your pain with labels. Self-awareness feels a lot like a hall of mirrors. At first, life is just feeling like something is missing. But as you get into self-awareness, new mirrors start to appear in your mind. Initially, these mirrors allow you to see yourself more clearly and from a variety of angles. However, the intention was always to move past the mirrors to get to the other side. Here's the twist, though. Once your mind is in too deep with self-awareness, you find yourself thrown into a loop of infinite mirrors, and the exit doesn't seem to move any closer to you. At level 1 of this self-awareness loop, you make the first realization that says, "Oh, I'm anxious." Level 2 then introduces the inner actor that asks, "Well, okay, why am I anxious?" The inner critic then responds, "Well, I'm analyzing my anxiety and I'll figure that out." Level 3 then emerges and you ask yourself again, "Wait, am I making my anxiety worse by analyzing it?" And you reflect on that for a while, and then you realize that now you're overthinking. However, you've already caught yourself in the loop, so you can't pull back now. Level 4 is when your mind doubles down even further, saying, okay, I'm overthinking, but am I overthinking my overthinking? And then level 5 hits, and that's when it gets even more absurd, and you finally spiral. Well, now I'm overthinking about my overthinking, about my overthinking, and so on. This is what the authenticity spiral looks like. In this mode, you endlessly shift between thoughts about every little aspect of your behavior. Everything you do feels performative, and nothing ever feels authentic. Any attempt to pull away and act normal only loudly gets criticized by the inner critic, who calls other aspects of yourself an actor. With meditation, it gets paradoxical. You sit down to observe your thoughts, but who's observing those thoughts? Now, instead of meditating, you're thinking about watching your thoughts about watching your thoughts. Well, what about journaling? Initially, you say that you're going to write to process your feelings, but you inevitably start writing for a future version of yourself who will read this journal. So you're no longer processing those feelings, but instead you're curating them for a future observer. The cruel irony of all of this is that the people who are most committed to self-awareness usually become the biggest victims of its darker consequences. They never actually get to enjoy any direct experiences because they are always at least one level away from being a single person with a single mind. Think about the most charismatic person you knew growing up. And I don't mean the one that aligned with your values, I mean the one that always seemed to get away with everything. If you're the type who grew up a quiet kid, the person that comes to mind is probably someone you didn't get along with very much. Perhaps they'd crack jokes loudly while the teacher was trying to move a lesson along, or they'd manage to ease their way out of trouble just by being funny. Somehow, it doesn't feel like they were particularly efficient at anything. Yet, their personality always got them by in life. Meanwhile, you felt like you had to work twice as hard only to get a pat on the back. People with zero self-awareness appear more confident, authentic, and charismatic for one reason only. They are not watching themselves. That way, they always seem to go according to life's tempo, no matter the situation. Spontaneity isn't just a quirky personality trait. Sometimes it could mean the difference between a fulfilling life and one that never truly feels satisfying. When you're constantly monitoring everything and never going with the flow, you get tired of your own mind's constant spirals. You're like an animal on a leash, only that you're also the one holding that leash. You might have heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's that thing where people with limited knowledge or competence in a domain overestimate their abilities without realizing that they were never that good in the first place. Lots of incompetent people think they are competent, and sometimes that actually helps. Just the conviction of knowing what you're doing can take you quite far in life. But there is a flip side to the Dunning-Kruger effect, and that's when competent people become paralyzed by the awareness of their own limitations. And that is the subtle way that self-awareness slows you down. First, you feel something, and instead of acting, you analyze that feeling. After that, you decide whether or not what you're feeling is appropriate, and then you finally choose a response. Depending on what you were thinking about, you could go from a few minutes to make a choice to a few decades. Yeah, I'm not kidding on that one. There are people out there who simply acted on seemingly absurd thoughts, and that got them to where they wanted to be in life almost instantly. Meanwhile, there are others who felt like what would seem too absurd to take action, so they spent decades in regret only to realize many years later that they could have made a move. Imagine you're at a networking event and you're watching a brilliant presentation by a keynote speaker when you're struck by a crazy thought. I have experience with this exact thing, and I should just go and introduce myself. Well, you freeze, and you begin to craft the ideal introduction, expecting the right moment to align for the speaker to be alone. The presentation is over now, and the speaker is swarmed by tons of people. You decide that it's not worth the stress, and so you move on. Meanwhile, at that same presentation, someone else in the audience thinks it'll be cool if they could connect with the speaker too. In order to leave an impression, they don't think twice, and they clumsily ask a question. The speaker answers, asks for their name, and thanks them for the question. In your head, you're thinking, well, that was a dumb question. And while, yes, you might be right about that, this other person's interaction meant that when they go on to introduce themselves to the speaker after they talk, they can recognize them and then they exchange contact information. Now, life isn't always going to play out in these ideal ways just because you're confident. Truthfully, it's possible for the speaker to simply roll their eyes and ignore the person's question. The paradox is this. Life is a lot like a dance performance. A person free from self-surveillance may stumble, but they keep moving to life's tempo. Meanwhile, the hyper-aware person who obsessively plans each step will often find that the music is stopped by the time that they've decided to dance. Something strange happens when you're too busy naming everything you encounter, viewing life through a lens, and never experiencing life with your own naked eyes. Soon enough, you'll only give yourself permission to exist when there's an appropriate label for every action or inaction. Your journey into self-awareness might have begun because you constantly felt uncomfortable, but you never quite understood what it meant. Then you learned about anxiety, studied how it manifests, and now you've realized that it's a core part of your struggle. But instead of growing beyond anxiety's limitations, you use it as a crutch. Because you identify as someone with anxiety, every nervous feeling confirms that narrative for you. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy that's hard to spot and even harder to break away from. As humans, we crave a coherent narrative for our lives. So attaching a label helps create a consistent story that you can tell yourself. This story begins to leak into aspects of your life that you never could have imagined. When you get invited to social events you might have enjoyed, you decide to skip them entirely because you believe the umbrella term of anxiety exempts you from ever appreciating anything outside. It's not just with anxiety that this happens. You could even associate your identity with trauma. While that makes for a valid reason for life to slow down, there are people who never truly manage to move past the role of a trauma survivor. Tragically, their pain becomes their entire persona, and that could alienate them from people and places, further reinforcing the impacts of their trauma. Sometimes, moments that may have opened up your mind to new experiences get abandoned because of narratives in your head. For instance, say you've failed at math a few too many times in high school. Now that you're older, you decide that you're not a math person, so you stop trying, and you completely close your mind off from the different branches of math that exist, where there could have been a few things that you might have actually enjoyed. The problem with subscribing to the idea of a single permanent narrative is that humans are a highly fluid group. Who you were a year ago can greatly differ from who you are today at this very moment. Likewise, who you were at college differs from who you are in the workforce. Carrying ideas of your identity from self-awareness alone into the life you're attempting to create only holds you back. If your identity is resistant to change, you might be too attached to the self you know, preventing you from engaging with the unknown. Self-awareness does this thing where you feel really good that you're learning new things. It overloads you with information about how your mind works, what triggers it, and how you can solve your problems. But it's a lot like learning stuff online. With all the resources and tutorials available, you get so distracted by the fancy theory and lessons available that when the time to put in actual work comes, you defer it with claims that you're just trying to find the perfect tutorial, a magical answer that can solve all of your problems and give you the skills that you're searching for. The hard truth that self-awareness hides from us is this. Some people would rather stay miserable in a story that makes sense to them than be happy in a way that contradicts what they believe to be true about themselves. Instead of a path towards a better life, they end up finding the perfect excuse for never moving forward. So, with that in mind, here's an uncomfortable question to ask yourself. Who benefits from your self-awareness? When you're up at 3 a.m., replaying conversations, correcting your appearance, and beating yourself up for not fitting in, someone out there is smiling, and I'm going to take a guess that that person isn't you. Living in a capitalistic system, there is no denying that your self-consciousness is a huge source of income to advertisers. If you spend any significant amount of time on the internet, you must have seen that advertisers are spending tons of money to constantly remind you of your shortcomings. Your face, well, it's not pretty enough. Buy this new makeup kit, though, that'll help. Your 3-year-old car is too old and rickety. Spend half your income paying this outrageous monthly car payment. Move out of your parents' house straight into a fancy luxury apartment. You're constantly being sold solutions to artificial problems. So of course you feel inadequate when you're not able to match a bunch of people that buy into the game of capitalism. Today, the self-improvement industry doesn't just sell anti-aging cream, it sells you something even harder to commodify, and that is your own potential. Coaching courses, blueprints, consulting, frameworks to model your personality around, they all promise to deliver the best version of you, a you that finally feels whole. But that version of you can never exist if you don't learn to accept yourself as a person, not just as a concept of a person. Obscuring your own emotions with fancy terms does not help you grow any faster than someone with zero self-awareness. It only makes you feel better mentally, but not emotionally. When the self-improvement industry tries to make you perpetually aware of your inadequacy, they do that because they know that satisfaction would be bad for business. Environments are designed to nudge you towards certain types of decisions. You're not anxious because you're self-aware. No, it's not that simple. You're self-aware because anxiety is profitable. The default state of inadequacy is a part of choice architecture. Everyone feels it in one way or another. You'll rarely find a truly satisfied person in our digital age. Problem to solution pipelines exist for the strangest things when you think about it critically. The process of self-improvement is ridiculously gamified nowadays, and don't get me wrong, to-do apps and journaling apps are great, but does your mental health really demand a monthly subscription for you to love yourself more? Really? Is the answer to your struggles growing a paid journaling app's digital pet on your screen? And sure, look, it sounds harsh for me to point this out, especially since it actually does help some people out. But the truth is that our environments created these problems in the first place, and then they turn around to sell expensive solutions to us. And all of this, everything that I've said so far, none of this means that self-awareness is bad or that growth is impossible. It just means that we need to be a lot more careful about the content that we consume on our journey towards improvement. So perhaps the first truly self-aware action to take isn't to analyze yourself more deeply, but rather it's to recognize who benefits from your analysis. Once you realize that, you can choose to refuse the transaction. That realization isn't something completely new. In fact, history shows that ideas of the self vary across cultures. In some places, the self is merely a distraction, not worth pursuing. When we think of Western civilization and her ideals, the earliest philosophers often come to mind. Figures like Socrates have played no small part in shaping society's core ideas. He promoted the belief that there is a real you buried somewhere underneath everything that the world assumes, and your job is to find it, to know yourself, and to be authentic. Was he right? Is our goal in life to know thyself and uncover our truth? If so, did our world evolve from this mentality? After all, therapy is not exactly new, and the people that shaped it were not perfect. Sigmund Freud is often credited as the father of psychoanalysis and a key figure that helped in shaping modern clinical psychology, and yet, he's the same person that introduced the concept of penis envy in young girls. Meanwhile, Socrates, in all his wisdom, claimed to have a link to the divine which guided him as a private inner voice that no one else could hear. Now, it might seem odd for me to point these things out about Western philosophy's biggest icons, but it does reveal a crack in our understanding. Western therapy developed itself from a place that says find yourself, from people who never quite had a final answer for what a self even meant. None of this means that Western philosophy is worthless, but it does raise some questions. What if the idea of finding yourself is built on an assumption that isn't, in fact, universal? Eastern philosophy started from a different place. Therefore, it may hold the potential answers to issues that exist with self-awareness. So, the big reveal with Eastern philosophy is nothing. The self is an illusion and should be dissolved. In Buddhism, this concept is called anatta, or no self. It doesn't mean you don't exist, you do, but rather Eastern philosophy doesn't pressure you to search harder, nor does it worry that you haven't found your authentic self yet. Instead, it presents a different way of thinking, one that rejects the idea of a permanent, unchanging you. You're not a statue waiting to be uncovered, you're more like a river, different from moment to moment, but possessing one name. This, in turn, reframes everything that we think we know. The West's search for meaning is much harder to justify today. Even mindfulness from the East has been rebranded into something that helps in our search for the self. Because of that, it's become a billion-dollar industry. Meanwhile, the version of mindfulness taught in Buddhism and other Eastern practices is not about how it leads to more material wealth. That's not why meditation is encouraged. The real purpose of meditating is not to create a calmer self, it's to realize that there is no self to calm. We are one with everyone and everything around us, a part of some greater whole. Yet, we turned a liberation practice into a tool for self-improvement. The Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi takes us even further. He didn't just point out that the self is an illusion, he actually said that the search for truth can become another cage. Pondering on whether he only dreamed he was a butterfly or if he's a butterfly dreaming he's Zhuangzi makes for a hilarious yet deep thought. You see, Zhuangzi himself didn't have an answer to this dream, and that was the point. Western philosophy demands, it screams for certainty, but Buddhism offers liberation through insight. Zhuangzi's answer is a shrug. Not an arrogant or a dismissive shrug, but a relieving one. He invites us to see that our desperation to cling to an idea of who you really are is simply another form of attachment. The self isn't solid, so trying to search for it is futile. Memory corruption, our performance of privacy. These aren't universal problems. Instead, they are symptoms of a culture that believes in a solid, findable self. If you don't believe in that concept to begin with, well, you won't feel as lost constantly. And yeah, it's humbling to accept this idea, especially when you're so attached to all that you already are and the idea of who you could be. But the truth is, if you're both the dreamer and the butterfly, well, why bother thinking about which one is the real you? Forgetting. Now, I'm not saying you should forget everything you know and go become a Buddhist. There is a value in both Western and Eastern philosophies. The real issue with self-awareness is that when it's all you ever think about, it becomes paradoxical. Observation changes what is being observed, and therefore you never truly get anything you were searching for in the first place. The truly terrifying aspect of self-awareness is this: the only way to find yourself is to lose yourself. So, what we're saying is, take risks, act, and learn to live without the constant narration or self-criticism, because the real you isn't the person you see in your reflection. It's the one dancing to the beat of life's drums when you forget to look. There's a feeling you've most definitely had before, but maybe you never knew how to describe it. It might come after a promotion you'd spent your whole life chasing, or after buying something that you convinced yourself would absolutely change your life, or perhaps after finally getting the attention of the person you couldn't stop thinking about. And hey, for a moment, maybe it felt incredible. But then something strange happened. That feeling faded. Not all at once, but just enough for a quiet thought to creep in. Now what? The exciting promotion quickly became a regular day at the office. The new purchase became another object in the room. The person you couldn't stop dreaming about slowly became just a real person. And before long, your mind was already reaching for the next thing. Not because you wanted it to, it just happened. 200 years ago, a philosopher named Arthur Schopenhauer looked at this feeling more closely than anyone else. What he discovered was so dark that he was once considered the greatest pessimist in the history of philosophy. The troubling possibility, however, is that he wasn't being pessimistic at all. He was simply the one paying the most attention. At the dawn of the 19th century, Europe was intoxicated with the idea of progress. Science was expanding humanity's understanding of the world. Industry was transforming entire nations. Philosophers spoke confidently about reason, advancement, and the steady march of civilization towards something better. To many of the great thinkers of the age, humanity's endless striving looked like evidence of a higher purpose. We wanted more because we were moving forward. But Arthur Schopenhauer looked at the very same world and saw something completely different. Where others saw progress, he saw restlessness. Where others saw purpose, he saw an insatiable longing. Where others saw humanity climbing towards a brighter future, he saw people trapped in an endless cycle of desire and disappointment. Schopenhauer was different from his peers, and many credit this trait to his time studying Immanuel Kant. Kant believed that the world we see, we hear, we touch, and we measure is not reality itself. It's reality filtered through the machinery of our own minds. According to him, concepts like time, space, and causality are not features of the world as it truly is, but lenses through which we experience it. What we perceive is merely a representation of reality, not reality itself. His conclusion was that the true nature of existence, the thing behind everything we see, is forever hidden from us, locked away beyond the reach of human reason. But Schopenhauer noticed something strange about Kant's reasoning, a loophole, if you will. If Kant was right, then there was one thing in the universe that he wasn't observing from the outside: himself. If we can't know the reality behind other things because we stand apart from them, then what happens when we turn inward? What happens when we examine the one thing we experience not as an object, but from within? And at first, the answer seems obvious. You might expect to find a thinking self, a rational mind, a stable personality sitting somewhere behind your eyes. But that's not what Schopenhauer found. When he looked inward, he discovered something far more primitive. Before every thought, there was an urge. Before every decision, a desire. Before every plan, a longing. Hunger, attraction, ambition, curiosity, fear. The constant feeling of being pulled towards something or pushed away from it. Beneath the stories we tell ourselves, Schopenhauer found a deeper force, one that seemed to be driving everything. A blind, restless striving that never truly stops. He called it the will. To Schopenhauer, the whole world is connected and shaped by one thing: the will. It's the force you encounter when you strip away your thoughts, your opinions, and the stories about yourself that you tell yourself. Beneath all of that, you find a constant pressure to move, to seek, to crave and avoid, or to pursue. A restless striving that never completely goes away. This will isn't acting on any single goal or destination or a plan. It just wants endlessly for the sake of wanting. It's like an engine running constantly, never turning off, driving every human, every animal, and even inanimate objects. He believed that when you truly look at yourself from the inside, the will is what you find running the whole show. It governs you, keeping you in a state of desire no matter how insignificant or important. A small itch on your forehead, the unbroken curiosity to learn what comes next, that is the ever-present will. Now, the will might sound like something we call willpower, but the two are not the same. Schopenhauer describes willpower as the thing that exists when you resist the will, but he considers it futile, because as a human, you don't truly have a will to power through in the first place. The will has you, same as everything else around you. You didn't decide to be hungry, or to want something, or to be drawn to the person who leaves butterflies in your stomach. That's the will's influence. Most of us like to think we're in control of our desires, that our conscious mind is the captain of the ship, carefully steering our lives wherever we choose. Schopenhauer disagreed. He believed the intellect is more like a narrator than the captain. It watches what the will is already doing, then invents reasons and explanations after the fact. You feel yourself wanting something, and only then does your mind begin constructing a story about why you want it. That's the part people miss when they talk about willpower. The struggle isn't between you and the will. The will is already a part of what you are. The most terrifying part is that the will never sleeps. Every desire simply reloads itself the moment it's satisfied. One want disappears and another rises to take its place. The cycle continues on and on without end. For Schopenhauer, this is the source of all suffering. Because to want something is to live in the absence of it. You only ever desire what you don't possess. Every longing begins with a lack, a gap between the life you have and the life that you imagine. In that sense, wanting is not fulfillment reaching towards you, it is the feeling of something missing. Wanting a car doesn't ache because you'd like to drive around so badly. Wanting here is the heavy sigh that leaves your body while standing on a chilly sidewalk waiting for a bus to come. The feeling presses on you, creating an ever-present ache where you're constantly reminded of what you desire not being yours. You might think that the thing you desire is the cure to this feeling, but that's where Schopenhauer breaks from conventional wisdom. Most of us treat pleasure as the goal, the reward, while we think of pain as a malfunction, an unfortunate interruption to an otherwise happy life. Schopenhauer saw it the other way around. Pain is the only thing that is truly real, while pleasure is just a temporary absence of pain. Instead of darkness being the absence of light, light is only a temporary absence of darkness. Think about the last time you had a toothache, the kind that follows you into every conversation, every meal, every attempt at sleep. In that moment, if someone offered to end the agony in exchange for your most prized possession, perhaps you wouldn't think twice. Yet when the pain finally disappears, what happens next? You don't walk around celebrating the incredible sensation of having healthy teeth. You don't wake up every morning overwhelmed with gratitude that your mouth is no longer in agony. The relief quickly fades into the background and then becomes your new normal. That's Schopenhauer's point. Pain announces itself while its absence goes unnoticed. You don't feel not thirsty. You feel thirsty and then relief and then nothing. You feel loneliness, then connection, then eventually that too just becomes ordinary. What we call pleasure is often just the brief moment where our suffering loosens its grip. And after that is a period of emptiness. And filling that gap isn't peace like you'd expect, it's boredom. An undeniable empty feeling where you're simply existing with nothing to chase. We love to tell ourselves that we're fine existing without anything pushing us, but whether we like it or not, we aren't designed to experience boredom blissfully. Something else quickly takes root in our minds. Therefore, life isn't suffering, then peace, then suffering. It's far, far more nuanced than that. It starts with the suffering of wanting, then the emptiness of having, followed by the suffering of wanting again. The clearest way to picture it is a pendulum, swinging endlessly between two painful extremes. The ache of wanting at one end, and the emptiness of boredom at the other. The middle of life's pendulum is that fleeting moment of contentment that you've been aiming for. But the pendulum keeps racing through the middle at its highest speed, never letting you dwell there. It's the tragedy of the 40-hour work week, spending 5 days straining on one end only for the weekend to flash by in the center, immediately dropping you back into the next cycle. Nowhere, does this play out more clearly than in having a crush. Think about your first crush. It is a feeling that is hard to describe. One where your heart, it drops in excitement, it flutters, and you so badly just want to be in that person's presence. For the folks lucky enough to actually build something with their crush, it probably seemed like bliss at first. And then the fantasy begins to dull. In your head you thought, well, this can't be right. After all, the fantasy version of them wasn't going to behave the way you're seeing them behave right now. Maybe they find your favorite movie boring, or maybe they aren't interested in the activities you were excited to try together. And in response, you feel empty. Back when it was only a crush, it felt like every force in the universe was pulling you to this one person, and yet, getting what you wanted kills the want itself. Next thing you know, there's a short emptiness, a period where there's no want anymore until your mind creates a new want designed to fill the hole inside. This illusion isn't just reserved for our hearts, it dictates how we interact with the material world. The person desiring a car mainly experiences the lack that comes from not owning a car, but once you get the car, after the initial joy, you slowly begin to realize that it isn't what you pictured. You start to worry about gas prices and the stress of finding a good parking spot, and then you realize that the car has certain quirks that you wish you had spotted before buying it. Following this, your mind starts to wander all over again, fantasizing about yet another car that will solve all of this one's troubles. You just can't win. This is the mechanism that drives every single thing in the universe. Unfortunately for you, you're the only creature aware enough to understand the psychological prison that you are trapped in. The will doesn't just govern human beings. It's also in the flow of water, the way sound travels across a distance. It governs animals too, the squirrel gathering food before winter, the cat chasing prey through the grass, the deer running from a predator. Every creature is driven by the same restless force of striving and survival. But the rest of nature is spared one crucial burden. They don't know what's happening to them. A squirrel suffers danger directly in front of it, but once that threat is gone, so is the suffering. Humans? Well, humans are different. You can suffer from things that aren't happening. You suffer your past with regrets. You suffer your present with doubts. And you suffer your future with uncertainty. The thing you said 10 years ago that still replays in your head at 3 a.m., the conversation tomorrow that you are dreading, your tendency to grieve loved ones who are still with us. None of these things are happening to you in the moment, and yet you are suffering for them anyway. Some of our sharpest tools, like memory and imagination, are the very things that make that suffering even more vivid. The squirrel isn't lying awake rehashing its past mistakes. This contrast is what makes being human so challenging despite our perceived superiority. Worst of all is our fear of death. We all know it's coming. Every move you make is in hopes that it's not coming too soon. Yet it is always a presence that you can never truly shake off. The knowledge that it's all going to end sits under everything you do, and it doesn't lift you up. It just hangs over you like a shadow. Every good moment shows up already stamped with the fact that it is bound to end, and that one day, so will you. You can never fully sink into anything because a part of you is always aware of the ticking clock that is our lives, and you know exactly where it's going. The squirrel doesn't carry that weight. You're the one animal awake enough to enjoy a moment while also being cursed to feel it slipping away. When you take a breath and contemplate all that consciousness implies, it feels like you're a part of a machine that woke up. You're aware that you want, chase, and you fail to be satisfied, and you still want again afterwards. And yet, awareness doesn't free you from any of this. It just means that you are present for everything that is happening to you, no matter what. For Schopenhauer, this isn't a random quirk or evolution making a mistake. It's what reality itself is when we observe it fully. None of that is a malfunction either. We are conscious creatures made of wanting, and suffering is built into our design. We can't fix it without straying away from the rest of our kind. You and I are reality, suffering through one of its more complicated shapes. Back in 1818, when Schopenhauer first began to develop his ideas on the will, our wanting loop was simply a part of the natural order of reality, one with a simple principle: to exist is to want. Now, in our modern world, that fundamental truth has evolved even further, becoming a highly potent business model. The very trap of life has been industrialized and commodified and aimed at us with twice the power. Think about it. Your online feed, your devices, your entire lifestyle, everything is sold as a product, when really it's just the pendulum of suffering swinging from end to end. The infinite scroll is the purest expression of the want, get, empty, want engine that has ever been built. You open your social media feed to kill a want, whether that's boredom, loneliness, or curiosity. Once you're online, you begin scrolling in search of a hit that will make things feel right, only for that hit to die in just a few seconds, and there you are, back to scrolling again. It never resolves itself, because a resolved want is a closed app. The very fact that you're participating despite being aware it's never going to bring you any true satisfaction is proof that there's a force bigger than yourself at play here. When you apply a concept like the will to advertising, things get even more depressing. An advertiser's entire job is to manufacture lack on purpose. You're made to feel the absence of something you were fine without just 10 seconds ago, and then those same people attempt to sell you a temporary relief. The entire economy is built on this loop. It's a world powered by Schopenhauer's negative theory of happiness. The system thrives not by giving you joy, but by constantly inventing new toothaches for you to cure. The universe gave us a blueprint. We adopted that design, and then we made it worse. There are currently rooms full of very, very intelligent people who are paid to make sure that your want never resolves. After all, your dissatisfaction is their product. And it's hard to see a way out of it, especially since it's a fundamental part of reality itself. If the machine is everywhere, is there really a way to escape any of it? So what if there was a way to take a break from it all? The obvious solution would be to get better at satisfying your desires, become more disciplined, more productive, better organized, learn how to pursue your goals more efficiently. But Schopenhauer believed this misses the point entirely. The problem isn't that you're failing to satisfy the will, the problem is that you are trapped inside of it. Every strategy for getting what you want still begins with wanting. Every achievement, every ambition, every carefully optimized plan is just another turn of the same wheel. You are still playing the game, you're just getting better at it. Real relief can only come from stepping outside of the cycle altogether. The difficulty is that the will reshapes the way that we see the world. You can rarely see a tree for what it actually is. Instead, you see shade, or firewood, furniture, or an obstacle in your path. We do the same thing with people. We don't really see them as they are. We see what they can give us, or what they can do for us, or what they might be taking away from us. The will turns everything into a means to an end. And as long as you're looking at the world through that lens, you are trapped inside the machine. Every object becomes another potential desire. Every experience becomes something to gain, or to lose, or to improve, or to chase. To escape the will, even briefly, you have to learn how to see differently. And that's where art comes in. In the presence of genuine beauty, something unusual happens. The mind stops asking what it can gain from an experience and simply enjoys the experience. When you stare at a beautiful sunrise, you're not thinking about the solar energy you can capture from it or the sunburns you might be getting. You simply admire its magnificence. Schopenhauer described this idea as becoming a pure, will-less subject of knowing. Just for a brief moment, you are no longer a person who is chasing, or planning, or comparing, or wanting. You are simply awareness itself. Think about the last time a piece of music stopped you in your tracks, or a painting held your attention longer than you realized. For just those few moments, you weren't trying to get anywhere. You weren't solving a problem or pursuing a desire, you were simply absorbed. That is what made art so important to Schopenhauer. Inspired by Kant, he believed that beauty pleases us precisely because it doesn't ask anything from us. You don't need to possess it or improve it or use it for anything. You are simply experiencing it. And in that experience, the will falls silent. For perhaps the first time all day, there is no lack to overcome, no desire to satisfy, and no future state that you are trying to reach. There is only the thing itself and your awareness of it. For Schopenhauer, this was one of the purest forms of happiness that life could offer. Schopenhauer was an art lover to his core. He played the flute every single day after lunch. It was one of the few activities he believed could genuinely free a person from the constant demands of the will. This led him to a fascinating question, though. If art allows us to step outside the will, why are some people so much better at creating it than others? His answer was the theory of genius. Most of us only escape the will by accident. A beautiful sunset catches our attention, or a song absorbs us. A painting briefly pulls us out of ourselves. For just a few moments, our desires go quiet before inevitably returning. The genius, according to Schopenhauer, can remain in that state for much longer. They possess an unusual ability to look at the world without immediately filtering everything through their wants, their needs, and practical concerns. While most people see objects in terms of their usefulness, the genius sees something deeper, the essence beneath the surface. That's why great artists often seem to notice things that the rest of us miss. A painter doesn't simply show you a tree, they reveal something timeless about trees. A composer doesn't merely arrange sounds into a symphony, they capture a feeling that somehow feels larger than any individual life. The genius sees beyond the ordinary perspective of the will, then brings back what they found. In that sense, every great work of art is an invitation. The artist is seeing for you, and for a brief moment, they are allowing you to step outside of yourself as well. As beautiful as all of that sounds, Schopenhauer believed that this distance from the will does come at a cost. The same ability that allows a genius to see beyond ordinary desires often makes it harder for them to function within ordinary life. While most people are naturally attuned to the practical demands of survival, of work, status, and social expectation, the genius is often distracted by something deeper. This is where the stereotype of the tortured artist begins to emerge. You can think of figures like Vincent van Gogh, who spent years battling his own mind and died largely unrecognized, or countless artists whose greatest gifts seemed inseparable from their own suffering. Schopenhauer believed that the very trait allowing these individuals to glimpse beyond the will often left them poorly equipped for the everyday world. His philosophy of art was built around two distinct experiences: beauty and the sublime. Beauty is the gentler of the two. It lifts you out of wanting without resistance, a piece of architecture, a quiet landscape, a flower moving softly in the wind. In moments like these, your desires simply fade into the background. The will loosens its grip, and you are left contemplating the world for its own sake. The sublime is different. It begins with something that should overwhelm you: a violent thunderstorm, towering mountains, the cold, incomprehensible scale of space itself. Your first reaction may be fear. These things remind you how fragile and insignificant you are. They confront the will directly because they threaten the very thing the will is trying to preserve: your existence. And yet, if you can move beyond that fear and simply observe what stands before you, something remarkable happens. The terror gives way to awe. Instead of seeing a threat, you see something larger than yourself, and in that moment you rise above the will rather than being a servant of it. But among all the arts, there was one that Schopenhauer believed stood apart from the rest: music. A painting depicts something. A sculpture represents something. Even the most beautiful landscape painting will still be showing you an image of the world. Music is different. Music doesn't copy reality at all. This unique quality led Schopenhauer to place it above every other art form. While paintings and sculptures reveal aspects of the world, music bypasses appearances entirely. It doesn't represent the will. It expresses it. For Schopenhauer, music was nothing less than a direct reflection of the force driving all existence. He went on to map music onto layers of reality, describing bass as the dead, inorganic world of stone and inanimate objects, the harmony as the plant and animal world, then finally, melody as human will in all of its longing, the way it wanders away from home and then returns. Together, it all lands as satisfaction. In his view, a melody is literally the story of a wanting self. In it, you'll find desire, the search, and resolution. When a song moves you, you're hearing your own willing nature played back to you. The sense of striving and longing not as pain or suffering, but as beauty. From the outside looking in, music gives you the chance to observe your essence without paying the price of actually wanting anything. It's the emotion without the suffering. Your own restless nature handed back to you as something beautiful instead of something hurtful. That's why music can level you when nothing else can. Art's influence cuts through every season of life. People tend to dismiss it as a decoration to reality's more serious demands. But that sentiment changes when something breaks. A death, a heartbreak. That's when you realize that you need a song or a poem, because nothing else can hold the weight of what you're experiencing. That pull we feel towards art in those moments proves that deep down, we already know why it matters. Despite these deep feelings about art and the solace it grants us from the will, Schopenhauer understood that it wasn't ever going to last. Aesthetic experiences were seen as the Sabbath of the penal servitude of willing, or in simpler terms, a day off from the hard labor of wanting. A day off. Not freedom, not a permanent escape. Because every song ends, and the will always come back. Art was only a glimpse of a deeper escape, never the escape itself. Despite its profound nature, art isn't the only escape hatch. Schopenhauer realized there are other, deeper ways to escape the will that may actually free you for good. One of these is compassion. Everything trapping you in suffering is centered on the idea of me, my wants, my life, my needs, my dissatisfaction. To free you from yourself, you have to turn towards others. There's a profound belief in Schopenhauer's work which argues that the wall between you and everyone else is part of an illusion. This very belief is the key to making a real exit from suffering. Because underneath the surface that we perceive, the will is the one thing that expresses itself in everything. The will that makes a rock crack when dropped is the same one that compels you to search for a silence to your pain. Therefore, we as individuals are not truly separate from anything else influenced by the will. This idea led Schopenhauer to propose that real morality exists when you're able to feel someone else's pain as your own. Genuine goodness doesn't stem from religion, rules, duty, or self-interest. It's something that can only exist from one experience: compassion. When you are able to feel another person's suffering as if it were your own, you reach a deeper level of existence. After all, we are all connected thanks to the will. So by shifting your perspective, the suffering of compassion becomes your own suffering as well. The Upanishads, a Hindu philosophical text that inspired Schopenhauer, described it in one simple phrase: "Thou art thou." The suffering creature is also you. Compassion means escaping your self-centeredness. When you're able to genuinely feel for someone else, your own wanting self goes quiet for a moment. That moment is a hidden key that unlocks your prison of me, the very prison generating your suffering. That's why compassion can often feel like a relief instead of a burden. When you feel it deep in your heart, the urge to comfort someone, to care for them, it's actually freeing, because it gets you out of your own head. The ego loosens its grip over your being and expands your mind beyond you alone. A compliment when you spot your favorite color on a cashier. A moment of genuine patience for the slow walker in front of you. The simple decision to listen to a friend's bad day without judgment. These moments don't really have any place in the will's grand scheme, and yet, when you let them into your life, the burden of your own worries fades into the background. If art is a day off from suffering and compassion softens the wall between you and everyone else, there's one final level to exiting the will that may provide a permanent escape. It's radical, because this time, instead of satisfying the wanting or avoiding it for a moment, you turn against it entirely. Schopenhauer calls it the denial of the will to live, and it's the ultimate climax of his life's work. The one thing he believed could actually free a person. When people decide to observe life all the way to the end, there's a mutual understanding of its nature. They usually land on one or all of these three things. The wanting never ends, satisfaction is impossible, and life is pretty much suffering all the way down. This realization hits like nothing else, and it often awakens something in an observer, making the will turn against itself. In this case, it means that the observer stops chasing. Schopenhauer confirmed this across history. There is a pattern of deep thinkers who chose to renounce worldly pleasures. We know them as monks, mystics, and ascetics. Their voluntary acceptance of poverty isn't a temporary protest, nor is it self-punishment. It's a deliberate starving of the wanting until it all goes quiet. Among all the avenues he observed, this withdrawal was most present in Buddhism and Hinduism. For Buddhists, the idea is that suffering comes from craving, and it only ends when craving ends. Saying this out loud, it sounds almost exactly like Schopenhauer's denial of the will. This exact similarity across oceans shows that Schopenhauer's life's work struck something deeply honest about the human experience. But there's something different about ending suffering by denying your human instinct to want. When the wanting is genuinely quieted, what's left isn't emptiness like you would expect. It's calm. A calm that's close to the Buddhist idea of nirvana. A state where the wanting is fully extinguished and you are truly free from suffering. For Schopenhauer, it's the nearest thing to salvation. Even though you never end up getting everything that you want, the trade-off is that you are no longer being ruled by wanting. Full denial of the will isn't saying, well, I'm just going to buy less stuff. It's the monk's path, and it is both radical and controversial. That's why most people will never attempt it. For all of his investments into this idea, Schopenhauer himself didn't follow a path of denying the will. He ate well, indulged himself in pleasures, and was a famously irritable person. He's the one who prescribed renunciation, yet he never took the cure that he proposed. Despite this, the core idea here is still worthwhile. Even if you can't become a saint or an ascetic, you can live a life less defined by your wants. Peace comes from wanting less, not acquiring more. This helps you loosen the grip of the will over your life. There's one last thing that Schopenhauer leaves us with, despite the dark nature of the will, and it might be the most useful insight of all that he made. Right from the moment you first gained consciousness, there have been recurring periods where you felt restless. When observed by the world around you, this restlessness was interpreted as a character flaw, a discipline problem, or simply a poor mindset. Teachers or parents and friends may have responded with their own opinions about who you are as a result. And after enough time enduring these criticisms, you started to feel like an exception to the world's rules. But Schopenhauer gives you something the world never could. You're only a wanting creature in a wanting universe doing exactly what you were built to do. That restlessness of not being enough, not having enough, and not doing enough is proof that you are alive and you are awake. The weight of self-blame is deeply isolating, but within the will there is a silver lining, one that tells you to stop trying to repair something that was never broken in the first place. In our modern life, we've been sold a promise that doing the right thing, like getting a job or hitting certain milestones, will lead to lasting happiness. That promise was false 200 years ago, and nothing has changed today. The proof is in that sinking feeling that keeps coming back despite your achievements. The sense of dissatisfaction isn't about you actually falling short. When you finally drop the expectation that things will bring you happiness, it allows you to walk away from a game that was rigged before you ever sat down. And the more clearly you see how the will works, the more you can work with it instead of against it. Because the best life isn't the one stuffed to the brim with pleasures. It's the one with the least suffering. And perhaps that's why his philosophy still resonates 2 centuries later. Because beneath all the darkness, Schopenhauer leaves us with a strange kind of comfort. The realization that your restlessness is not a personal failure. It isn't a flaw in your character or a mistake that you need to correct. It's part of something much larger than you. That same force that drives you to dream, to strive, love, create, and search for meaning is that same force driving everything else. The difference is that for a brief moment in the history of the universe, that force became conscious enough to observe itself. To understand how you are the universe experiencing itself, watch this video next. There once was a kingdom with many different religious sects who constantly argued over metaphysical truths. Is the world eternal, or is it finite? Does a person who has attained enlightenment live after death, or do they perish like the rest of us? Seeing this unrest, the king gathered blind men and brought before them an elephant. Each was allowed to feel only one part, but describe the whole elephant. The one who touched the head said it felt like a jar. Another, who felt the tusk, insisted it was a spear. So soon they were arguing over what the elephant truly was. This is the Buddhist parable of the blind men, and it perfectly encapsulates the limited subjectivity of our belief systems. The Buddha believed that people only see different sides of the whole, and so they engage in petty quarrels. In more recent interpretations, this parable is used to suggest that just as the blind men had one part of the elephant, each religion is simply one aspect of a larger truth. Religious thinkers from the Renaissance thought something similar when they uncovered what they believed was evidence of an ancient theology in texts believed to be written by an Egyptian saint named Hermes Trismegistus, who translated to Hermes thrice greatest, which, by the way, is just such a cool name. The Renaissance philosopher Marsilio Ficino believed this body of writing was the first text to reflect an ancient theology, or prisca theologica, which they believed had the true theology that threads through all major religions and many different philosophies. The notion that all religions share a common theology is appealing for several reasons. It implies that there's no reason to fight over which is true, as they're all just perspectives on the one truth. Thus, it supports religious pluralism and almost demands tolerance and respect for other forms of worship. And it's a nice story, but ultimately, is it true or even plausible? Is there really an ancient theology that connects all religions and many great thinkers? Well, for one, Hermes could not have been the first sage. His writings were later found to have originated in late antiquity, so that's long after Plato. As a result, Hermes would have then been a beneficiary of the work of ancient Greek philosophy and existing religions. We know this because the writings of Hermes come from the period when Greek and Egyptian cultures overlapped and merged in Egypt. But while this ancient theology may not be accurate, it does point to something important. For most major religions, there are common threads that are worth exploring at different levels of belief that exist in almost every religious or philosophical belief system. I don't subscribe to the notion that all religions are the same. There are important differences that matter. But in the most popular religions, levels of belief are often implied. Sometimes it's the followers of a religion that makes these distinctions clear, thinkers like Soren Kierkegaard, and sometimes it's in the great texts. Regardless, we can see an implied structure of belief, a path from immaturity to mature religiosity. And that may not be a straight arrow, but there are clearly higher and lower levels to consider that may be useful to you for whatever path that you decide to take. And now I want to go into the first level of belief. Level 1, the pursuer of pleasure. The first level represents someone who has not seriously engaged with any religion. I'm not simply referring to an atheist or an agnostic, however. This is a person who is consumed by the pursuit of pleasure. Many religions and ancient philosophies specifically targeted this dogged pursuit of pleasure, where a person holds pleasure as their highest aim. You can see this in the Bible, the Quran, Buddhist texts, the Analects, and the Bhagavad Gita, Plato, Stoicism, and much, much more. The only school of Greek philosophy that frames pleasure as a positive aim is Epicureanism. This fundamentally hedonist school of thought where you evaluate things based on the pleasure gained and the pain that you avoid. It's not so much about being fed grapes in the middle of an orgy, although that would be perfectly fine if you're an Epicurean. In the Bible, the pursuit of pleasure is largely associated with sin. It's considered a temporary joy that ultimately leads to misery and pain. It's only the consequences of sin that have a lasting effect both in life and life after death. The Quran considers pleasure a sin if it becomes an end in itself, distracting one's focus away from God. In Buddhism, our desire and attachment to worldly pleasures are primary causes for suffering. Our pleasure is only temporary. When we let ourselves become attached to it, we doom ourselves to an endless cycle of suffering. The problem is not the object of the desire, but the desire itself and our attempts to hold on to worldly things. When we let ourselves become attached to it, we doom ourselves to an endless cycle of suffering. The problem is not the object of the desire, but the desire itself and our attempts to hold on to worldly things. When Nietzsche wrote about the death of God, one of his main concerns was that humanity would do after moving beyond religion. He came up with the concept of the last man to describe the unfortunate ways people grapple with nihilism. The last man responds in one of a few ways. They either comfort themselves with illusory beliefs, sink into a deep depression, or preoccupy themselves with entertainment. In the latter case, pleasure has become their highest aim, and in the century and a half since Nietzsche's writing, it seems that the pursuit of pleasure has truly become the last man's primary coping strategy. The Christian existentialist Soren Kierkegaard offers one of the most thorough accounts of the pleasure seeker in the first volume of his book, Either Or. In the last section, The Diary of the Seducer, the first-person narrator, Johannes, is a self-described aesthete, someone whose aim is to maximize their pleasure. His main aim is to pursue love in its most exciting form, without commitment or any greater meaning. In his own words, "I am an aesthete, an eroticist, someone who believes in love and knows it from the ground up, and only makes the private reservation that no love affair should last more than 6 months at the most." In the diary, Johannes courts a woman in a way designed to bring him the greatest pleasure. Once he sees the potential object of his affection, a woman named Cordelia, he embarks on a game of seduction. He learns as much as he can about her and inserts himself into her life. Johannes then moves forward with his conquest by befriending Edward, a man who is deeply in love with Cordelia. Johannes coaches him, only to swoop in and steal Cordelia's hand before Edward can request an engagement. Through letters and in-person encounters, Johannes slowly convinces Cordelia to sleep with him before marriage. After their night together, Johannes has no interest in seeing her again. He has gotten all the pleasure he wanted from their courtship and cruelly discards her. So, what was Kierkegaard's point in this tale of pleasure and cruelty? It was, ultimately, along with the rest of Either Or, to demonstrate how the life of the aesthete, no matter how calculated, leads to disillusionment and despair. Another level of belief is required to avoid such a dissatisfying fate, however. Level 2. Inherited faith. Odds are that most people you interact with on a daily basis don't seem particularly religious. They don't bring up religious values, nor do they take the time to actively participate in religious practice. And yet, you see polls suggesting that the majority of people identify as belonging to one religion or another. The people you know may offhand suggest that they're Catholic, for example, despite the fact that you know that they don't go to church or pray the rosary. They say they belong to a religion, a lot like the way you might identify with the country you're born in. Rather than treating religion like a choice to pursue a belief system, it's more like saying you're a Capricorn because you were born in January. This is a telltale sign that someone has inherited their faith. They identify as Christian or Hindu or what have you because their parents did. They may even go to church regularly, but don't seem particularly interested in reading the Bible for themselves. Obviously, your family has a significant impact on which belief system you identify with, but culture plays an enormous role as well. A person growing up in a nation that is overwhelmingly of one religion is more likely to identify with that faith. As with family influence, this identification can easily be a surface-level belief. Soren Kierkegaard took issue with this lackadaisical level of belief. He famously insisted that we are not born a Christian, rather we have to become one. In his book, Attack Upon Christendom, Kierkegaard criticizes the idea that simply being born in Denmark makes you a Christian. He felt that the church had tried to make Christianity so accessible that it no longer reflected the New Testament. It made everyone a Christian by default, and when everyone is a Christian in this way, it doesn't exist. I want to take a moment to express my sympathies with those who stay at this level of belief. Many people identify with their parents' religion because it gives them a sense of belonging. To reject their inherited faith might entail walking away from a family or just becoming less involved. They may also not want to feel like an outsider in their community. In some cases, being an outsider has very serious consequences, which brings us to the next level of belief. Belief out of fear of authority. Humanity has a long history of imposing religious belief systems on unwilling participants. For over 300 years, the Spanish monarchy enforced Catholic orthodoxy. They prosecuted hundreds of thousands of people whom they believed were secretly practicing other faiths, such as Judaism or Islam. They killed thousands and expelled hundreds of thousands of Muslims and Jews. In the process, they created an atmosphere of fear and paranoia. These trials and killings were famously carried out by the Spanish Inquisition, which became well known and feared for its methods of torture and secret trials. The history of religious persecution is filled with violence and brutality, but you don't need the threat of death to coerce others into belief. Religious communities routinely ostracize and outcast people for turning their back on their faith. They often stand to lose everything they care about, including their families and their homes. So that's human authority. But we also need to consider divine authority. In Christianity, there are huge consequences for not believing. You risk eternal damnation and all that entails. Much of what we imagine to be hell was conceived in literature, such as Dante's Inferno, but regardless, it doesn't sound pleasant. Some believe in a religion, not out of love, but out of fear of the post-mortem consequences. You either believe and you're safe, or you don't believe and you risk severe punishment. The philosopher Blaise Pascal turned this ultimatum into a case for believing in God. In Pascal's wager, you weigh the possibility of eternal damnation versus believing in God and receiving the reward in heaven. For him, this was a no-brainer. Obviously, you should choose God. What do you have to lose? However, there are more considerations involved in this simple wager. There's the fact that you still have to place a bet on a specific God. You still ultimately have to gamble, whether that's on religion being true or false, or on a specific religion among thousands that exist, with many different consequences for choosing incorrectly. Perhaps more importantly, choosing to believe in God out of fear doesn't get you all the way there. You have to buy in, which means overcoming your skepticism. One common way people do this is by moving to the next level of belief. Level 4, self-interest. What's in it for me? That's often why many of us buy into religion, or at least it's a fair starting point. As Pascal implied in his wager, there's plenty to gain from adopting religious beliefs. What could be greater than the promise of an eternal heaven or preventing eternal damnation? Something almost everyone struggles with is the possibility of the endless night. Without a belief in the afterlife, life just ends. Your consciousness ceases in everything you know. All your experiences and your bonds with others, they just no longer exist for you. To suggest that they're out of reach would be inaccurate, as there is nothing left for you to reach. There are, however, helpful philosophical angles for this problem. Epicurus famously said something to the effect of, "Death does not concern us, because as long as we exist, death is not here, and once it does come, we no longer exist." It's a nice way of viewing the problem of death, but it doesn't quite erase the anxieties and the despair of that endless night. In Fear and Trembling, Soren Kierkegaard writes, "If a human being did not have an eternal consciousness, if underlying everything there were only a wild, fermenting power that, writhing in dark passions, produced everything, be it significant or insignificant, if a vast, never-appeased emptiness hid beneath everything, what would life be then but despair?" This take is perhaps a bit dramatic, but it does point to what is gained: eternal life and the end of existential despair. Not every religion promises an afterlife, but they all have an approach to the problem of death. Buddhism often takes a different approach to the question of eternal life, which is illustrated well in the Sutta Pitaka. The story is a dialogue between the Buddha and a monk named Milankya-Putta. The monk suggests that the Buddha has ignored many important metaphysical questions, such as what happens after death. He threatens to quit unless he gets some answers. The Buddha responds with an analogy, as he often does. He asks the monk to imagine someone struck with a poison-tipped arrow, but instead of just letting the surgeon remove it, the injured person states, "I will not let the surgeon pull out this arrow that wounded me until I know if the man who wounded me was tall, short, middle height, dark or brown or gold-skinned, whether the man lived in a village or town or city, and so on." The Buddha goes on with more details, but the point is that the man dies long before he gets answers to his question. For the Buddha, the poisoned arrow is the urgent matter that needs to be addressed. The poisoned arrow in the analogy represents our suffering that arises from our endless craving. Before bothering with the questions of the afterlife and the cosmos, we should first end the suffering that plagues us. In Buddhism, enlightenment is not only the cessation of desire for lasting pleasure, but also the detachment from the self and the eternal soul. It resolves our concerns for the endless night by removing our desire to go on. It pulls out the poisoned arrow that causes us to despair to begin with. Getting into Buddhism starts with the promise of what is gained in this life, the end of our suffering. It's in our self-interest, even if it involves acknowledging that there is no self. Level 5. Taking responsibility. At this stage, you are more willing to examine your religion and ask important questions. You'll scrutinize the meaning of texts and try to understand how they all fit together. This is also, unfortunately, when people are most likely to leave their religious communities, especially if they don't get satisfying answers to their questions. Your approach to religion may become very rational. You reject things that seem illogical or contradictory, and you're willing to point them out. This is why this stage can be filled with conflict. Some choose to return to their old way of thinking about belief, while others continue to grapple with its complexity, leading to a more complex understanding of their religion. In the Theravada branch of Buddhism, there are 4 stages of enlightenment. When one enters the first stage, Sotapanna, they've stopped believing that following rites and rituals will lead to enlightenment. In this first stage, they intimately recognize that there's no permanent self or eternal soul. They no longer doubt the path as they know it works and have given them a sense of happiness and freedom. In this level of belief, you're taking control and you've committed to diving deeper into your religion. Once you've taken responsibility for your own belief, there's still a significant path ahead. How will you reckon with the truth of your religion now that you've bought in on a deeply personal level? You may be inclined to pursue it rigorously and with the urgency that your commitment demands of you. We're talking about changing the way you live every day and making real sacrifices. Level 6. Religious maturity. At this level, you've honed your focus on a divine purpose. You're less torn between worldly concerns and your belief as you've let religion become the focus of your life. This is a level that most people do not achieve and are probably not interested in attaining. This stage often results in a form of asceticism. That's when you forego worldly pleasures and relationships to focus on the divine. Monks are what we typically associate with this level of religious belief. In Hinduism, this level of religious maturity is called the sannyasa stage of life. This is where you reject material desires and, importantly, your prejudices against others. In the Hindu faith, it's important not to treat others as completely separate from yourself. The deity, Brahman, pervades all things and all people. Mistreating others is to injure yourself, which is a strange thing to do. Why would you do that? In Buddhism's third stage of enlightenment, one's sense of desire has completely ended. You no longer wrestle with craving. Similar to the sannyasa stage in Hinduism, your sense of compassion is unconditional. You no longer hold ill will towards others. The Buddha, however, warned against extreme asceticism. His doctrine of the middle way suggests finding a path between indulging in sensual pleasures and self-mortification. The point is not to starve yourself of pleasure, but to reduce your attachment to them. The ideal lifestyle, then, would still be modest and simple, but not one that actively punishes you. In Kierkegaard's text, The Purity of Heart is to will one thing, he describes this religious stage of maturity. You move on from double-mindedness, where you are distracted by pleasures and selfishness, and focus on the good. Kierkegaard describes this person as the knight of infinite resignation. They've given up everything in this world to focus on achieving the eternal life in the next. They no longer consider the temporary to be worthwhile. It's just a distraction from God. When you believe in your religion at this state of maturity, you don't feel the need to put off focusing on it. It becomes the passion project that you can't put down. It's the video game you stay up until 2 a.m. trying to beat. You're going for that high score with the divine, and you refuse to put that controller down, even if that means going hungry and ignoring all other worldly things. Now, imagine for a second they made religion a video game. On second thought, forget that. They probably have, and it was likely terrible. Anyway, You might be thinking at this point that we're at the end of the levels of religiosity. Belief at this stage is strong and true and can't be doubted. How can you get any higher than that? Well, the truth is we have one more level of belief. I know that seems impossible, but it's true. The last level is about taking that religious intensity and doing something very important. Level 7, letting go. In his writings, Kierkegaard identified 3 spheres of existence: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. But within the religious sphere, there are 2 types: religiousness A and religiousness B. A is the ascetic life I just discussed, the person who focuses on God and rejects worldly pleasures. Religious B is our final level of belief. They've made a leap of faith that religiousness A hasn't. Becoming an ascetic and focusing on God is firmly in our control, but to take a leap of faith is to completely rely on the divine. It is to relinquish control. To have faith is to make a logical leap. In monotheistic religions, you have to buy into the idea that there is only one God. And in the case of Christianity, sort of 3, sort of 1, it's a bit of a mess. The paradox is the point. Anyway, there's no objective proof for God's existence. If there were, there would be no room for faith. You would just believe in God like the way you would believe in the shoes on your feet. To believe is to take a leap of faith, which Kierkegaard suggests may put you at odds with reason and even human ethics. It may make you isolated and lonely, as it's a subjective experience that cannot be explained rationally to others. To truly believe in God is to subjectively believe rather than rely on others and supposed proofs. In the history of religions and philosophy, there have been many arguments for and against the objective existence of God. For Kierkegaard, that's sort of a waste of time. If God could be objectively proven, there would be no reason for faith, and thus there's no personal commitment. You have the math right there. But by having faith, you let go of your need to control your religious fate. You trust despite how absurd it may seem. You don't try to learn or come up with objective truths for why you believe in what you do. There are too many mysteries and paradoxes in transcendent truth, making a comprehensive explanation nearly impossible. You have to let go of objective certainty. In the 9th century, a Buddhist monk named Linji Yizhuan told his disciples, "If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him." It's a provocative piece of advice, but what does that mean exactly? Ultimately, it is the idea to kill your conceptualization of the Buddha. You have to let go of external authorities and even your own conceptualizations of spiritual beliefs. Your experience of enlightenment will be personal and inward. In Zen Buddhism, you're looking for the mind beneath all formal structures, such as logic and words. You're trying to exist purely in the moment. You have to move beyond thinking of the Buddha and specific doctrines. You have to forget the path and guidance. You have to kill the Buddha to get to the real nature of one's own mind. Taoist philosophy is focused on letting go of a greater purpose and embracing a way, also known as the Tao. Instead of focusing solely on a god and serving its will, Taoists are encouraged to practice Wu Wei, roughly translated as non-purposeful action. In Taoism, the universe is generated by cosmic order that, if followed, can lead to flourishing. When you act without a greater purpose in mind, whether that's a project or self-interest-based goals, you're more able to go with the natural flow of the universe. The less purposeful your action, the more you let the order of the universe flow unimpeded. And that is the final level of belief. While each example is different, they all, in the end, imply letting go of something that we come to hold too tightly, even if we came to grip it because of our religions to begin with. So maybe the blind men were never meant to agree about the elephant. Maybe the point was not to collapse every religion into one indistinguishable truth, but to recognize the limits of our grip on it. Across traditions, across centuries, we see the same movement. From pleasure to inheritance, to fear, to self-interest, responsibility, devotion, and finally, to surrender. Not surrender as if in defeat, but surrender as in release. The release of certainty, the release of ego, the release of the need to be right. At the highest level of belief, you are no longer clinging to the tusk or the trunk or the tail. You loosen your hands entirely. And strangely, that may be the closest anyone ever comes to understanding just how ginormous the elephant is. Not by feeling for its individual parts, but by moving back and feeling the amount of light and wind that it blocks out.
I made my first video on this channel in July 2017, after months of going back and forth on whether or not I actually wanted to create a YouTube channel. What would people think? What if people hate the videos and tell me that I don't know what I'm talking about? Who am I to talk about these topics? These were the thoughts that flooded my head. If you've ever been in a situation where you have to start something or give a presentation in front of a group of people, then I'm sure you've had a similar emotion. It's the fear of being judged, the fear that keeps us in chains and holds us bound from achieving our true potential. To understand why we care so much about what others think about us, we have to go back to the beginning of human history. Man, like many other animals, evolved to be social. Our survival was dependent on close-knit communities, tribes, and clans. We would hunt together, make shelter, and protect one another from predators should they dare strike. Being together made us thrive. So, at the time, being cast out of the clan almost always meant death. Without the technologies we have today, making shelter, hunting, and protecting yourself from wildlife was almost impossible for one person to do alone. Sadly, even now that our society has evolved to a point where we no longer have to worry about predators, and we have the tools and resources to provide food, clothing, and shelter for ourselves, the need to be part of a group still has been maladapted to our current reality. Then we were scared of being left out in the cold. Today we're scared of getting cancelled on Twitter because of something we said, or getting insulted for repeating clothes on Instagram, or getting hate comments on your YouTube video of people telling you your voice is becoming redundant and boring. You see, this feeling of being ostracized has worsened woefully because of social media. By creating likes and dislikes, we brought to light this need to feel validated and seen. In an instant, you can see just how many people support you, and that number can be addicting. It gets to the point to where we stop saying what we really want to say, and instead start saying the things we know will get us the most likes. Before you know it, you're posting certain thoughts, photos, and writing specific statements to get that attention and validation from others. How many times have you seen your favorite influencers and creators online suddenly sell out, where it feels like they're no longer authentic, only doing or saying the things they know will please the algorithm? I made a video about Unit 731 and the despicable things the Japanese government did in the Second World War. However, because it was not advertiser-friendly content, according to YouTube, the video didn't perform extremely well, and that's fine. This is the kind of ostracization and social conditioning that makes people fall in line and stop saying anything that might offend the people with money. It's like they tell you there's freedom of speech, but only when your microphone is turned off. Growing up, I always felt different. Of course, I had friends and wanted to be part of the social group, but I had questions about the universe that people just didn't like to discuss. Who wants to talk about death and the afterlife on the school playground, after all? Because of that, I felt different from everyone else, like a piece of a puzzle, but from another set. And so I grew up worried that everyone would look at me as weird and different. So I tried my best to hide my existential dread to fit in like everyone else. If you're watching this video right now, there's a high chance that you were also once a kid like me who was so worried about being disliked that you shield the real you just so you wouldn't be thought of as different. If you're still in that position, listen. Stop caring so much about what other people think and start living your life authentically. Yes, caring what others think is healthy. However, it becomes hurtful when we try to change ourselves just to be liked by others. You would enjoy your time on this floating rock far more if you choose to live your authentic self. And if someone rejects you because of it, you'll know that they were never meant for you in the first place. Now, if that sounds like a lofty dream and not really grounded in reality, I understand. Because the sad truth of this entire thing is that we do need to be judged fairly by others. At its core, that's what makes our society work. We agree that something is law, and whoever breaks it gets judged. We agree on certain moral principles, and whoever breaks them gets socially ostracized. We're judged at our places of work, in school, in our society as a whole. As sad as it sounds, gossip and ostracism help the greater good of the group. In 2014, Stanford professor Rob Willer led a study that explored the relation of gossip and ostracism to the harmony and functionality of experimental groups. In this study, Rob found out that groups that allowed their members to gossip and vote out underperforming members were able to sustain cooperation and prevent selfishness much better than groups that weren't allowed to do so. When we think of ostracism, we almost always see it in a bad light. However, this study proved that it does have a much more important role in preventing the weak and vulnerable from being bullied and ridden upon. Have you ever been in a group for a school project, only to quickly realize that there's one person who just wouldn't do anything because they know the group will pick up their slack? How's that make you feel? Now imagine you could remove these people from the group and then gossip to other groups about how bad of a team player they are. It might seem harsh at first, but because of our innate fear of being ostracized, more often than not, these people would see the reality of what they're doing and actually act better when reinvited into the group. It also prevents these selfish people from exploiting the more vulnerable people in the group and allows them to reach their full potential without fear of being taken advantage of. The researchers concluded that exclusion compelled participants to conform to the more cooperative behavior of the rest of the group. So yes, we need to be good team players for the proper functioning of society. However, being part of a group should never be at the expense of our own individuality. We should never get so scared of being ostracized that we do not say the things that matter to us for the fear of being judged. We need to realize that we will get to a point in our lives where we'll begin to assess everything that we've been taught as children. When you start to outgrow old beliefs and walk into new ones, do not be held back by the fear of what everyone who you grew up with would think. Caring about what other people think is necessary for the proper functioning of society. But when caring what other people think affects our abilities to make decisions for ourselves, that's when you need to pause and reconsider. You're a person with their own thoughts, ideas, dreams, and goals. Don't let the fear of being disliked hold you back from expressing that. You want to drop out of school to become a comedian? What would people think? You want to start a YouTube channel? What would people think? You want to be with someone from a different culture or religion? What would people think? This one question holds so many people back from doing what they love. It's like a chain that binds our neck and leaves us no room to breathe. We're like circus elephants, held back by a rope that might only exist in our imagination. Ultimate freedom is having the courage to be disliked. The boldness to stand firm in what you believe in, even when the crowd is saying something else. The courage to stand when everyone else is sitting, and run when everyone else is standing. The courage to be your authentic self, regardless of what everyone around you tells you to be instead. Developing the courage to be disliked is not easy. Remember that it's in our nature to care what other people think, so to stray from that even minutely would mean going against our very own biology, and that's never very easy. But the good news is that we can actually do it. The first and most important thing to realize is that everyone, just like you, is worried about their own insecurities. When we go out into the world, we're often so consumed with our own insecurities that we feel like everyone else is thinking about us and condemning us. But the reality is, more often than not, just like you, people are so worried about themselves that they aren't really thinking about anyone else. And when they do speak out against us, they're often projecting their insecurities on us, trying to bring us down to feel better about themselves. Don't let them do that. The difference between ostracization in early humans and what we have today is that with the early humans, it was only your closest relatives and members of your clan that could cast you out. However, today, because of social media, anyone and everyone can have an opinion about us, share that opinion, and we're forced to take notice of it. The problem with this is that we're taking criticism from people we wouldn't take advice from. Think about it. If you wouldn't let this stranger into your house for fear of invading your privacy, why would you let them into your head, the most private place of all? Sometimes the people judging you and not letting you live your true potential aren't strangers. They're childhood friends and relatives. When that's the case, we need to remind ourselves that the consequences of living outside the group is not as sinister as it used to be. You have the tools and resources to thrive away from your primary group. And in fact, you can find another group to join, one that would accept you for who you are, and not try to force you into being something you're not. I know I've said some negative things about social media in this video and many others, but there are some positives as well. In this scenario where you no longer feel part of the group you were born into or grew up in, the internet offers you a community of people who are willing to accept you from all over the world. You just have to take the time to find them. Lao Tzu wrote in Tao Te Ching, "Care about people's approval, and you will be their prisoner." The courage to be disliked is the key that opens the prison doors and sets you free to be the person you've always wanted to be.
Here's every single philosophical idea explained so simply that even a 5-year-old can understand. Philosophy, with all its hypotheticals and isms, can be very overwhelming. But behind these ancient thinkers and their fancy words, all philosophy is doing is two things: trying to understand how the world works, and suggesting how we can live better in it. There are so many different schools of philosophy, and I'm going to do my best to try and explain most of them. Cynicism. This ancient Greek philosophy was founded by Antisthenes, a student of the famous philosopher Socrates. It advocates for a life of simplicity, virtue, and freedom from societal conventions. That sounds a little broad, doesn't it? Well, let's dig a little deeper. We're all used to thinking of cynicism as a negative thing in today's world. However, the philosophy of cynicism is anything but. It tells us to live in sync with nature. Nature isn't just trees and oceans in this case, but the ebb and flow of human nature. Cynics trust their instincts rather than adhering to what society wants them to do. Cynics strive to achieve virtue, which they define as living a self-sufficient, ethical life that isn't achieved through superficial desires, but through reasoning and discipline. Basically, they want us to get rid of any focus on money, possessions, and status, instead finding value in ourselves rather than material possessions. The famous cynic Crates of Thebes exemplified this when he gave away his wealth to live a life of simplicity and virtue. This kind of anti-materialistic behavior leads cynics to be deeply critical of institutions and traditions like politics and religion. To a cynic, these institutions are corrupt and can lead us away from that virtuous life we're supposed to strive for. Cynics practice something called asceticism, which means living with only what we need. So instead of opting for that Dyson hair wrap or a completely frivolous sports car, stick to the basics: a few pairs of clothes, minimal home decor, and affordable transportation. With extra material items out of focus, cynics believe that we can achieve true personal freedom, which is central to the cynic philosophy. If we are dependent on things, then we cannot be independent and free. Another practice key to cynical philosophy is shamelessness. This practice is perhaps best illustrated by none other than the behavior of one of the more well-known cynics, Diogenes of Sinope, who lived from 412 to 323 BC. He engaged in acts simply to shock others and expose the hypocrisy of societal norms. Apparently, he urinated on people who insulted him, defecated in a theater, masturbated in public, and gave people the middle finger for no reason at all. He wanted to provoke people to reflect on why they found these acts so offensive. One of the key goals of being a cynic is self-mastery, which allows you to be unaffected by external circumstances. So if we look at Diogenes' unconventional behavior, we might see that he was, in fact, completely unaffected by the external circumstances around him and did whatever he wanted to prove how frivolous our expectations of each other are. Diogenes also pushed the envelope when he reportedly lived in a large jar or barrel, owning very few items and mocking those who pursued material wealth. While this kind of stunt might be considered performance art in today's world, he was trying to show that true freedom comes from mastering our own desires. He believed that material wealth enslaved people and prevented them from true happiness, and he took it to the extreme. When he saw a boy drink water out of his own hands, Diogenes got rid of his only drinking cup, because why use a cup when you can use your own 2 hands? We think of the word cynicism as something negative and skeptical. To be a cynic is not necessarily something to be proud of, but the original philosophy was about something much more positive and aspirational. Sure, it had some crazy followers like Diogenes, but we can reframe our interpretation of cynicism and see it as a philosophy that insists on simplicity in order to find freedom. Cynicism had a major impact on philosophy and influenced other belief systems like Stoicism, which also emphasizes self-control and living in accordance with nature. Stoicism. This is a philosophy that originated in ancient Greece in the early 3rd century BCE. Its founder, Zeno of Citium, studied ancient authors like Socrates. Stoicism, similar to ancient cynicism, teaches us to live in harmony with nature and practice self-control. Nature, to the Stoics, is the natural order of the universe. We've all heard people say, it's in the universe's hands. This is a Stoic idea, that there is so much beyond our control, if we try to resist it, we'll never achieve virtue and freedom. To Stoics, there are things within our control, like our thoughts, actions, and choices, and there are things that are out of our control, like external events and the opinions and actions of other people. These two elements, what they call the dichotomy of control, lay out simply what we should be focusing on, the things we can control, and the external factors we should let be. Encompassed in this dichotomy is the idea of amor fati, or love of fate. Stoics embrace whatever happens and see challenges as opportunities for growth. They believe this attitude fosters resilience. Sometimes they'll even contemplate the worst-case scenarios to prepare themselves for potential hardship. In our everyday lives, this kind of contemplation could be a physical habit, like taking a cold shower to introduce ourselves to an uncomfortable situation on purpose. This way, when uncomfortable situations arise outside of our control, we feel prepared. Similar to not worrying about what we cannot control, Stoics focus on the present moment as opposed to being preoccupied with the future. If we ruminate about what might happen, we will miss out on what is actually happening right here and now. This fosters an interconnectedness with the rest of humanity, where we are able to feel and identify ourselves as part of a larger whole. Once we can do that, we will see that kindness, empathy, and a sense of duty emerge because we will feel truly in harmony with others around us. If we can master all of this, we might become virtuous. In Stoicism, there are 4 elements of virtue: wisdom, also known as good judgment; courage, which is being strong and brave in the face of adversity; justice, being fair and treating people with respect; and finally, we have temperance, which is self-discipline and moderation. It might seem overwhelming to achieve a truly virtuous and stoic lifestyle, but habits like journaling and identifying role models who stay present and move easily through life without anxiety or stress can be relatively easy steps to take. If Stoicism has a relatively positive connotation of living in the present and accepting the universe as it is, nihilism might come across as a bit more negative. Nihilism. Nihilism rejects traditional beliefs and values. Nihilists tend to be skeptical about the existence of any objective truth or life's purpose. It tells us that life has no inherent purpose or value, and that any so-called meaning attributed to life is debatable and constructed in our own heads. Nihilism challenges that there is any absolute moral truth and suggests that any moral values we feel we have to adhere to are just constructs of our own mind and society. For nihilists, any sort of system like politics, religion, or cultural institutions are based on arbitrary beliefs. Who is to say that anything we believe is actually true? Since they don't believe in any sort of organized system, nihilists question authority and prefer to focus on individual freedom. In the philosophy of nihilism, individuals can create their own values and define their own purpose. This, in theory, is pretty liberating. We can be and believe whatever we want, but does that ultimately connect us with other people around us? Not really. Collective beliefs are often what binds society or even just a group of friends together. Nihilism can lead to feelings of despair or alienation, as its followers grapple with the idea that life lacks any sort of true significance. On the flip side, these kinds of feelings that provoke free thought can also inspire creativity and internal transformation. Nihilism forces us to look inward and potentially unlock layers of ourselves and our internal beliefs that we would have never found before. For example, a non-nihilist might state a fact like, the sun is shining and the birds are singing, therefore it is a beautiful day. Would anyone dare to disagree with this statement? Probably not. But a nihilist would ask, what is the meaning of beautiful? This kind of questioning linked to nihilism has often been co-opted by pop culture. Just think back to those multicolored shirts from Forever 21 that said, whatever. Whatever is a very nihilist attitude. It's basically saying, none of this really matters because none of it is objectively real. However, some notable people who embrace nihilistic ideas also reject the inherent negativity within it. Charles Bukowski, an iconic American poet, novelist, and writer, shared the nihilist perspective that life didn't inherently have any meaning. He also meshed that idea with dark humor as a way to cope with the idea. For Bukowski, if life had no inherent meaning, we might as well embrace the imperfectness of our present situation and not think too hard beyond it. A thinker from a much older generation, Friedrich Nietzsche, saw the inherent negativity of nihilism as an opportunity. For him, it was a way of thinking that we could pass through in order to create our own values. Nietzsche, who lived from 1844 to 1900, challenged traditional values and critiqued institutions like religion. He diagnosed modern society with a crisis of nihilism where traditional values have lost their meaning, but there's been nothing to replace them. He suggested a different type of nihilism that was more active. In this concept, we destroy our old value systems in order to create new ones. We don't just stir in a void of meaninglessness, we come up with something to put in it. Some might call this optimistic nihilism. Before we continue, if you'd like to know more about these philosophies or have a concise way to remember all of them and how they relate to one another, we've made something for you. This is the Aperture Philosophy Map. It's a poster that shows a brief explanation of all of the philosophies we've covered on this channel, along with how they all connect with one another. Think of it as a cheat sheet for understanding what these big ideas mean and how they can relate to each other. You can put this on your wall, your desk, anywhere. It's a perfect way to share your passion for philosophy with people around you, and it's such a great conversation starter. Plus, the design just looks really good. I personally love the colors. If you'd like to see the bigger picture in philosophy, or just want to support the channel, check it out through the link in the description. Now, back to our story. Optimistic nihilism blends the main idea of nihilism, that life lacks any inherent meaning, with a more uplifting outlook. For optimistic nihilists, even though life might not have any meaning, there is the opportunity to both embrace that sense of freedom and also come up with their own meaning. The first step in embracing this general idea is accepting the meaninglessness of life. In typical nihilist fashion, life has no purpose, but with an optimistic twist, that lack of meaning should feel liberating. It gives us the freedom to define our own goals and values. Once we do that, we're suddenly exercising all sorts of creativity and self-expression. It gives us the freedom to enjoy every minute of our lives without searching for some deeper meaning or purpose, but also gives us a sense of joy and curiosity. If we practice optimistic nihilism, we might find some inspiration in the vast meaninglessness of the universe. While run-of-the-mill nihilism can lead to isolation and despair, an optimistic twist actually encourages connection to other people. In this version of nihilism, finding community is an important element in creating our own values and meaning. Nietzsche outlined two types of human morality. One, master morality, which values strength, creativity, pride, and individuality. This is the kind of morality that optimistic nihilism strives for. And the other, which is slave morality, values humility, empathy, and submission. This kind of morality, which is more associated with traditional nihilism, usually comes from an individual feeling of resentment of people and institutions. Nietzsche argued that most people are dominated by slave morality and stuck in this nihilistic loop, unable to flourish and escape to master morality. Someone who is able to transcend into master morality and create their own values is, according to Nietzsche, called an Übermensch. In his eyes, we should all strive to be an Übermensch. Nihilism and its optimistic sibling are major players in the philosophical game. They've influenced movements like absurdism and postmodernism. The ideas of nihilism appear in literature and art to contemplate human existence. But perhaps nihilism has had the most influence on existentialism. Nietzsche's emphasis on individual freedom and making our own meaning influenced existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. Existentialism is a philosophical movement similar to optimistic nihilism, which emphasizes our responsibility in creating meaning in a world that may inherently lack it. One of the main pillars of existentialism is that existence precedes essence. Okay, so what does that mean? As articulated by the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, it means that we as individuals are not born with a predetermined life purpose. Because of that, we have to define our own essence, which is our identity, values, and purpose. The mere fact that we exist means that we have agency over who we want to be. This freedom, though, comes with responsibility. Existentialism insists that we are free to make our own choices, which is great, but that means we bear full responsibility for who we are and how we behave. Existentialism can be very liberating, but it also forces us to take ownership of our lives. We cannot expect anyone or anything to step in and give us purpose. For some people, that might sound great. They want to take the reins and assert ownership over every moment. But for others, the responsibility of that can lead to anxiety. There are so many choices. How do we know which ones to make? If there's no inherent meaning, is my life a waste if I can't make the most of it? These kinds of questions can lead aspiring existentialists down a bumpy path. Another difficult point to grapple with in existentialism, or a high mark depending on your perspective, is that it values the individual over the collective. Each person has to navigate their own life and create their own meaning without relying on collective norms or support systems to do so. That kind of agency, void of any reliance on community, might be music to some people's ears. But for many, community and its influence is the very thing that helps define their life's purpose. As you can imagine, action is very important to existentialists. Thinking that you want to be a certain way or do a certain thing doesn't have much meaning. I could think or even say, I want to run a marathon, but that's far from actually doing it. If I wanted to employ some existential thinking to that idea, I would start training and eventually run the marathon, because I know that my choices and behaviors are what give my life purpose. Along with his nihilistic ideas, Nietzsche also incorporated some existential thinking and advocated for creating our own values in a, as he put it, God is dead world. Alan Watts, a modern-era British philosopher, writer, and speaker, was known for his ability to interpret Eastern philosophies for Western audiences. Although existentialism is not an Eastern philosophy, Watts focused on existentialist ideas like personal freedom, creating meaning, and confronting the absurdity of life. He frames life as a cosmic game, or a dance. The goal isn't to achieve something, but to engage in the process. His work blended these kinds of existentialist ideas with Eastern perspectives, which we'll get into in a bit. Albert Camus also wove existentialist ideas into his teachings, but his main focus was in the area of absurdism. His essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, talked about the tension between our search for meaning and the universe's apparent indifference to that search. This led to the absurd. The core idea of absurdism is that the absurd comes from the interaction between our own consciousness and decision-making and a world or universe that couldn't care less about what choices we make. Camus argued that even though this tension and the absurdity of it can't be changed, we can embrace it. Accepting the absurd means recognizing life's lack of inherent meaning without becoming hopeless. This is where absurdism differs from nihilism. Instead of surrendering to that meaningless, absurdism encourages defiance. It tells us to rebel against the temptation to seek false meaning or to entirely give up, especially when things feel very bleak. Merely living is an act of defiance against the absurd. Camus used the Greek myth of Sisyphus, who was condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for all of eternity, as a metaphor for human existence. Even though rolling a boulder up a hill forever with no apparent destination might seem useless, Camus liked to imagine Sisyphus finding contentment in doing it. "One must imagine Sisyphus happy," he wrote. Absurdism would argue that apparent bleakness and living in defiance of it can lead to great creative breakthroughs. We are free to infuse our lives with only things that we create. If you've ever approached a creative project, you know that often the benefit of art comes from the process of making it, not the final product itself. You don't have to be a great painter to benefit from the freedom and expression that sitting down and painting can give you. The same sort of idea can be applied to life itself in absurdism. Mortality is an important element of absurdist thinking. Absurdism doesn't see death as a negative. It sees it as a call to live fully and in the present, to enjoy the process. Absurdism tells us to reject despair and practice defiant joy in the face of the darkness and meaninglessness. Writer Charles Bukowski created characters who lived outside conventional boundaries and pursued their desires unapologetically, rebelliously. And for him, as an author, writing was central to his survival and sense of purpose. He did not need to finish a single line, but instead managed to find creativity and purpose through the act of writing itself. "Find what you love and let it kill you," he famously wrote. Finding this sort of pleasure in life's purpose also brings in ideas from the philosophy of hedonism. Hedonism says that pleasure and avoiding pain are the primary motivators of human life. Therefore, its core ideas revolve around maximizing pleasure and minimizing suffering. There are two different types of pleasure. Physical pleasure is immediate sensory gratification, such as eating a delicious dessert or getting a relaxing massage. Mental or emotional pleasure is long-term satisfaction, joy, or intellectual fulfillment. Think of kissing someone you love or diving into a great book. These mental and emotional pleasures are more enduring and profound. Basically, when you think of hedonism, you can think of pleasure, pleasure, and more pleasure. Quantitative hedonism focuses on the amount of pleasure. More pleasure, regardless of its type, is better. Qualitative hedonism argues that some pleasures, like the intellectual and emotional ones I just mentioned, are more effective in avoiding pain. Avoiding pain is key to hedonism. In an ideal life, we transform necessary or unexpected pain into a manageable experience instead of suffering through it. The timing and duration of the pleasure is also very important. Immediate gratification can feel good and has its value, but long-term happiness and avoiding future pain should take precedence. We're often told to be wary of instant gratification, and most hedonists would agree. However, unlike cynical philosophy, hedonism rejects asceticism, the denial of physical pleasures. Hedonists believe that we all should be allowed to pursue the things that bring us pleasure, no matter if they are material or physical, if they make us happy. Instant gratification isn't always the most beneficial, but it certainly has its place. Some practical applications of hedonism could be practicing self-care. If you want a spa day, have a spa day. And if you're craving a hamburger, go get one. Savor connections with friends. Cuddle your dog. Listen to music. Even making your morning coffee every day can bring so much pleasure that you should take time to revel in it and make it a habit. Some hedonistic philosophies, however, place a lot of emphasis on moderation as we pursue ultimate and lasting pleasure. Epicureanism is one of those philosophies. The ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus advocated for simple pleasures and cautioned against excess. In the end, he warned that excess leads to suffering. Although moderation is a key piece of Epicureanism, it still aligns with hedonism in its pursuit of pleasure and the absence of pain as the path to happiness. The key difference with Epicureanism is that not all pleasures are worth pursuing. Some, in fact, can lead to greater pain or harm. Epicureanism also teaches that having any sort of fear of entities like God or death are major sources of anxiety that can hinder our happiness. Like absurdism teaches that the universe is indifferent to our choices, Epicureanism is grounded in the idea that God is indifferent to how we go about our lives and, therefore, is not something to fear. Death, according to Epicureanism, is simply the end of sensation and consciousness, so similarly, is also something that we should not fear. All the happiness that we need exists in our simple pursuit of life. It comes from eating, finding shelter, and enjoying companionship. Anything overly luxurious can lead to dissatisfaction. Staying in a 5-star hotel might bring temporary happiness as you enjoy amenities and the view, but once you're back in your 1-bedroom apartment, does that hotel stay suddenly cut you off from finding happiness in the simple things in life? Instead of stays in 5-star hotels, Epicureans emphasize friendship over wealth or status. They also put a lot of value in the pursuit of knowledge. Understanding the natural world can help dispel fear and bring pleasure. These types of pursuits can lead to ataraxia, the Greek word for tranquility. One thing that Epicureanism says will definitely not bring tranquility is the involvement of politics and public life. These pursuits, it says, can be stressful and distract from our personal happiness. If you've turned on the news or scrolled through social media recently to read about current events, you can probably confirm this idea. Instead, Epicurus suggests being more private and spending time and energy on close friends and family. The good life, according to Epicureanism, is one that embraces simple pleasures, thoughtful choices, and meaningful relationships in order to find inner peace. If we embrace these, we can overcome fears and unnecessary desires to live a happy and fulfilled life. How? Try a gratitude journal and express thanks for the small things in your life that bring you joy. Find a community that you find encouraging and interesting. That could be a yoga studio, a writing group, a dinner party, or any other space that feels meaningful to you. If we take a step away from traditional ancient Western philosophies, we can find inspiration in someone like Alan Watts, who brought Eastern thinking into Western culture. He bridged the gap between traditions like Buddhism and Taoism and old-school Western thought. Watts was critical of Western materialism and consumerism. He wanted to help the Western world shift from a goal-oriented mindset to one that values the journey and present experience. Ironically, a lot of these ancient Western philosophies were already attempting to address that problem. But Watts found more freedom and influence in Eastern thinking on how to combat things that plagued Western society. Spiritual practices like Buddhism, which emphasize the importance of living in the present moment and embracing the idea that spiritual awakening is found in everyday life, resonated with him and ultimately with the Western audience that he taught them to. Buddhism was founded by Siddhartha Gautama, known as the Buddha, approximately 2,500 years ago in India. Buddhism is all about understanding the nature of suffering and achieving liberation from it. Buddhism contains the 4 noble truths. Dukkha tells us that life involves suffering. It is inherent to existence. Samudaya suggests that the cause of suffering is craving, attachment, and ignorance. Nirodha says that suffering can be overcome if we get rid of cravings and attachments, which will lead us to liberation, also known as nirvana. And Magga says that the path to cessation of suffering is something called the Noble Eightfold Path. The Noble Eightfold Path is Buddhism's practical guide to living, development, and wisdom. The path is right view, understanding the 4 noble truths, right intention, having good intentions of goodwill and harmlessness, right speech, speaking truthfully and kindly, right action, behaving ethically, right livelihood, earning a living without causing harm, right effort, cultivate wholesome thinking, right mindfulness, always be aware of the present moment, right concentration, develop deep states of meditative focus. As you can see from this path, Buddhism is all about rejecting anything that causes harm, while also cultivating thoughts and actions that benefit not just yourself but other people. It tells us not to harm other humans or living things, not to steal or lie, not to fall susceptible to temptations like alcohol or sexual misconduct. If we follow these basic rules, we will cultivate good karma. Karma refers to actions that have consequences on future experiences. Has anyone ever told you that's bad karma if you stepped on an innocent bug or sped dangerously through an intersection? They might be onto something. Buddhists also believe in a continuous cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. This cycle is influenced by karma. One of the ways we can cultivate a Buddhist way of thinking and living is through meditation. Meditation is central to Buddhist practice since it helps develop concentration and mindfulness. Mindfulness simply means that we are fully present and aware in every moment. Buddhism is both a philosophy and a way of life, so how can we apply it to our everyday life? Meditation is the surest way to incorporate Buddhist ideas and practices into your routine. We often think, I don't have time to meditate, but we have time to scroll through our phones, to watch TV, or to do our skincare routine. Why not take 10 minutes out of your day to sit down, close your eyes, and breathe? If you really don't think that you have those 10 minutes a day, then you can try to integrate practices like right speech and right action into your life. Could the thing you're about to do cause harm? Is the thing that you want to say productive and kind? Asking ourselves these questions can lead us to live in a more Buddhist way. Alan Watts also celebrated Taoism, an ancient Chinese philosophical and spiritual practice with its roots in Lao Tzu and the foundational text, the Tao Te Ching. Taoism tells us to live harmoniously with the Tao, which in English is often translated as the way. The way is the fundamental principle that flows through all of existence. It is both the source of all things and the natural order that sustains them. If we can understand and align with the Tao, then we can live in harmony and balance. Sounds a little abstract, doesn't it? Well, here's how Taoists apply that to life. Wu Wei tells Taoists to act in harmony with the natural flow of things. It's not that we should do nothing, but we should avoid anything that feels forced and allow things to unfold naturally. You can think of this as trusting your instincts to not push anything into your life that doesn't feel like it belongs, whether it's a job, a partner, or a pair of jeans that you really want but just don't fit right. Taoism also wants us to live, think, and act simply. If we overcomplicate things, have too much ambition, or pay too much attention to material items, we're getting in our own way. We've all been there, getting in our own heads or obsessing over a distant goal. That state of being never feels harmonious, and Taoists are all about harmony. Taoism recognizes the interplay of opposites represented by yin, passive and receptive energy, and yang, active and assertive energy. We all have both yin and yang within us. You might know people who definitely have more yang energy, who seem to be doing a million things at once, and you probably know people who have more yin energy, who quietly move through life, seemingly always relaxed. For Taoists, finding a balance between these forces is ideal. To achieve this balance, Taoism teaches 3 virtues: compassion, being kind to others; humility, avoiding being a know-it-all; and moderation, practicing restraint. Taoism encourages letting go of desires and the need for control so we can find freedom from the inevitable turmoil of worldly things. And like so many other philosophies, it encourages living in the present, not dwelling on the past or worrying too much about the future. Here's the kicker though, we can't fully grasp the Tao through rational thought or language. We have to experience it intuitively. How? Meditate and practice breathwork to find your inner calm. Tai Chi and Qigong are physical practices aimed at harmonizing the body, mind, and spirit. And Feng Shui, physically changing your environment to align with the natural flow of energy, can also lead to that elusive harmony. Taoism tells us to let go of rigid control and embrace spontaneity. So perhaps you can bring those ideas into your day, to let go a little bit. All of these philosophies are really aiming for the same thing: happiness and harmony. They all stress the importance of recognizing the natural world. They all incorporate art and creativity into their practices. They all rely on mindfulness and reflection. Even though they come from different thinkers and parts of the world, it's easy to see the link between so many of these ideas. The great news is that you don't have to choose just one to follow. Did any of these ideas resonate with you? Maybe you want to pick and choose which practices and ideas you incorporate into your own life. Ultimately, that's what these philosophers and spiritual leaders did. They found some teachings and feelings that spoke to them and pulled all of them together into a new philosophy. So, now's the time to be your own philosopher.
If I steal from the rich and feed to the poor, is that good or bad? If I drive over the speed limit to get my sick child to the hospital, is that good or is that bad? What is good and what is bad? what is morality? And do you, as a person, have morals? Morality is what society treats as right and acceptable. They're the standards of thoughts, behaviors, and actions that everyone in a group agrees to follow so that they can all live peacefully. When you define it like that, morality does sound like law. However, while the law is influenced by morals, they're not the same. Stealing is against the law. Whether you're stealing from the rich or from the poor, stealing is a crime. However, a lot of people would consider stealing a piece of bread to save a homeless person from dying of hunger moral. Driving over the speed limit is a crime, but when it could help save the life of a child in the backseat of your car, it becomes the most noble of actions. Trespassing is a crime, but when there's a storm coming and you don't have anywhere to go, hiding under the shade of someone's porch will definitely not get you in society's black book. On the flip side, there are also some things that are considered immoral but are not criminal. Cheating on a test is a crime, but cheating on a partner is not. However, both of them would most likely be considered immoral. Breaking a promise is one of the most immoral things you can do, but unless it was a written agreement about a business contract, you normally won't get into trouble with the law for it. Although law and morality are different, they're quite similar in many ways actually. Both morality and law are built on the foundation of respect for all humans, as well as the autonomy of life, property, and beliefs. They're also both there to guide the behaviors of people living in a community so everyone can live together in the most peaceful ways possible. Just that one is written and the other is usually unspoken. I made an entire video about unspoken rules in society, and most of them are simply our moral obligations as members of that society. More often than not, the law expresses the morality of that time and place. Just a few years ago, it was illegal to smoke weed almost anywhere in the United States. However, as morality shifted towards tolerance for people to enjoy it, so did the law. Now, whether they did that for moral reasons or simply because they can tax it at a pretty high rate is a different discussion entirely, but anyways. As humans evolve and learn new things, our morals change. This is why morality isn't stagnant. It evolves with time as people share their experiences and beliefs about the world. Think about issues like premarital sex, same-sex relationships, abortion, marijuana use. These are all things that were considered immoral long ago, but today, society is beginning to accept all of these as moral. We've learned to be tolerant of people regardless of their personal beliefs or preferences. And while not everyone might agree to all of these things or practice it themselves, things seem to have flipped, and it's now considered immoral to criticize the people who choose to live these lifestyles. Throughout human history, morality tended to have been tied to religious traditions. However, now more than ever, we're moving to a place where morality is no longer tied to religion whatsoever. It's more of what the social norm is, and how you operate around that social norm. We now recognize the need for secular morality that transcends people's personal beliefs, and is instead seeking the good of the general public. However, there is one argument against this type of morality: the idea of subjective morality. You see, there have always been debates about whether morality is subjective or objective, usually in religious or philosophical spheres. People who believe that morality is objective often say that if morality becomes subjective, everyone can simply create their own morality, and then we can never say that they're wrong about anything. Because who are we to say that their own definition of morality isn't the right one? And while there is some truth in that, there still are of course many flaws in that argument. If morality is objective, there needs to be substantial similarities in what every culture considers correct and acceptable, as well as actions that are also considered taboo universally. But it is almost impossible to find a moral issue that every culture in the world agrees to, even murder. Think about Nazi Germany and how it was thought of as moral to kill in that culture. Think about cultures that practice cannibalism, or still make human sacrifices to their deity to this day. If even the most barbaric of actions aren't considered barbaric in every culture, how can we possibly say that morality is objective? Another problem with the argument of objective morality is that for morality to be objective, it has to be defined by an outside entity, in other words, a god or at least something that is hard-coded into all of us as humans. But in that case, most religions do not agree on the rules that have been given by their god. In fact, even within religions, not everyone agrees to or follows the same set of rules. So how do we then determine which group of people are right about what is wrong? When people think of objective morality, what they're actually talking about is cosmopolitan morality. Because the world is now so connected, we're more open to new and diverse experiences. Experiences that are helping us shape a new definition of morality. One that we can all agree on. But as we've seen in the past, getting everyone to agree on something is relatively impossible. This type of morality only exists on the internet, the biggest cosmopolitan metropolis. But when you step outside and look into the real world, into the billions of people that are not connected to the internet, you'll be met with a vast difference in what is considered right and what is considered wrong. Delphi, named after the ancient Greek oracle, is a simple artificial intelligence system that has been designed to make moral and ethical judgments. The Allen Institute built Delphi to answer one question: can machines learn morality? On the surface, it might seem like a simple question with a straightforward answer, but research done on Delphi says otherwise. Delphi was once accessed by a group of human judges, and they determined that her ethical judgments were around 92% correct. Correct being decisions that humans are likely to make in the same scenario. When Delphi was released into the wild via the internet, a lot more people agreed with what these human judgments thought of Delphi. Yes, she wasn't perfect, but even humans aren't perfect moral beings. As we gain new experiences and begin to understand the life and struggles of others, we learn more and become wiser in our judgments. But you see, there are two main problems with Delphi and other AI systems like her. First, because Delphi was created by humans, she can quickly become as flawed and prejudiced as the people who created her. The creators of Delphi were ones who chose the ethical scenarios that would be used in the system. They also chose the people who would judge these scenarios. This means that, at least in part, Delphi is a product of the morality of her creators. So, until we can find a way to eradicate the prejudices that currently exist in our world, whatever AI we create will continue to express those thoughts. But this time, we won't have anyone to hold accountable. Secondly, you see, morality is not just critical analysis. Morality is intertwined with emotion, attachments between friends, partners, parents, and children. These are the foundations on which morality stands. Take away the emotions, and all you're left with is critical analysis, and decision-making based on cost and reward. And this is simply not morality. This is why when Delphi was asked, "Is it right to leave one's body to science?" she responded with yes. On paper, the benefits outweigh the cost. But it is only when we look at it through a lens of both emotions and logical reasoning that we realize the human life is far greater than any benefit, especially when there are other explorable options. More and more, we're seeing lawyers defend their cases using MRI scans and the neurology side of morality. Because let's say a certain person was making life decisions while at the same time having a massive brain tumor affecting their thought processes. If the person was not capable of making a moral decision due to medical conditions beyond their knowledge, can we even blame them for their actions? Morality is a function of the brain. If the area of the brain just behind the forehead, inches away from the eyes, gets damaged, a person's moral judgment can completely change. Their moral judgment, especially in life or death situations, becomes warped. They're willing to take a life as long as it's done to save another. In a study, people with this type of injury were willing to strangle a baby as long as it would save someone else's life. It's vile and unthinkable to you because you feel compassion, guilt, and embarrassment. But when the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for creating these emotions, is damaged, so is your moral compass. Without the emotional system being in place, we're just like Delphi, left only with the ability to make utilitarian cost-benefit analyses. So as long as we're saving one life, taking another seems completely fair. Only when you look at it through the eyes of compassion, through the lens of morality, do you realize it's immoral and barbaric. So if morality can be affected by our biological makeup, what is morality? Biological or cultural? In truth, it's both. Biologically, what distinguishes us from other animals is our ability to make moral judgments, and this ability is down to 3 things. We can anticipate the consequences of our actions, we can make value judgments, and we can choose between alternative courses of action. These 3 things work together to give us the ability to make moral decisions. However, while the ability to make moral decisions is biological, moral codes of conduct are strictly culture, built out of the need to cohabit successfully. That's why every culture has its own morality. It's a complex thing. Just like every human is on a different journey of life, we are all guided on that journey by different moral compasses. This is why morality is a difficult subject to talk about. Because no matter what you say, there will always be some people that disagree with you. What some people consider moral, others consider immoral. What some people consider justice, others think of as revenge. But getting everyone to agree on a set of guidelines to follow should not be the only end goal of talking about morality. Because while we might not get all the answers we want or a clear path we should all follow, discussions on morality, how it's formed, and how it affects us, can give us a look into the lives of others, and give us insight on how we should live our own. It helps us learn how others think, why they act the way they do, and why some people fight forcefully against certain ideas and beliefs, and hold on dearly to some others. Talking about morality, in a sense, makes us all more moral, because it teaches us why we are the way we are, and how we can improve upon that. Morality is not measured in absolutes, but fractions of different pieces from different places that make up the whole pie we have come to know as humanity.
Picture this, if you will. You're about to send a text message. You read it for one final check, and you notice something's off. It sounds a bit too eager, so you rewrite it, but, well, now it feels forced.